I have to say it's such an honour to be here. It's not often as academics that we have an opportunity to really talk about things that we are really passionate about, particularly in the area that I work in, which is evaluation and evidence. So I do feel privileged to be here and to share some of our research findings. And I do want to give a broad view and share some of those findings. But first, I must pay my respect and gratitude to the Hong Kong HKSYU University and the Centre for inviting us here today and holding a conference in what I think is one of the most important topics of our decade, which is the use of evidence. So my message today is going to be a very simple one. I want to start at the beginning and I want to focus on the idea of evidence use in the education system more broadly. I want to think about, at every level of the education system, how are we using evidence? What evidence are we using? And most importantly, I want to consider its impact and its worth. I am an evaluator, and that's part of the work that I end up doing. What I think is important is to start at the very beginning. And it was great that our the speakers who are opening the conference talked about the worth and the amount of evidence that is available to us now. And I wholeheartedly agree on the idea of getting us as educators, all the beneficiaries of education and the data that's available, thinking about evidence. So let's go to the very beginning. As I said, it's a really good place to start because let's think about what's been happening in terms of the notion of evidence and its use over time. As I said, I'm really interested in the impact of evidence-based use and the increasing amount of data that is available to us all. But I do have some interesting messages. Part of the research that the University of Melbourne has been engaged in is looking at the impact, the merit and worth of evidence-based practice. And there's some not so great news. When you look internationally, we know that teachers more generally aren't really using the evidence that we promote as real evidence in their classrooms. The use of evidence as researchers and perhaps policymakers consider at a systems level is also questionable. There are pockets of success. It gets even more confusing when you consider the nature of what constitutes credible evidence. We each have a different view. What we do know that is all our work in translation and promotion of evidence-based practice does not appear to be having an impact on our student achievement or the learning lives of our students. And when we consider the number of evidence-based institutions that are promoting evidence around the world, it is hard to see the impact in the classroom. I'm talking about clearinghouse, what works. So the question is, who's actually using all of this evidence that we're creating? And you heard this morning that there is so much data available that we could do research on to understand. And you know, as well as I do, that there is so much data out there to help us understand teaching and learning. But who's using it? So if this is the case, why are we bothering to continue in promoting evidence-based practice? I guess the answer is because we know from other sectors that it could work. It's the right thing to do. To promote innovation and change based on real evidence can make a difference if we work in the right manner. So let's stop for a minute and think about what evidence we're really talking about. What I want you to do for a minute is think about your own definition of what quality evidence is in your mind. Actually, let's stop for 30 seconds and talk to the person next to you. Tell them what you think evidence is. If you could do that, just for 30 seconds. Have a think about it, because I'll want you to hold on to that thought. Okay, so what do we really mean by evidence and where is it? I am sure that many of you have said, well, it's stuff that's in peer-reviewed journals. It's stuff that's in the clearinghouses, online communities of practice, peak body organisations. The policymakers have it. Educators and school leaders have some information. And think about the websites and social media. What's interesting to note is that everybody has a different view about what constitutes credible evidence. The growth of evidence, as you've heard this morning from the two speakers who opened the conference, the growth of data is phenomenal. We are absolutely and utterly awash with so much data. Its accessibility is easier than it ever has been. And what you have to consider, we're not just talking data from the researchers. The data that I often think about, the evidence that I think about, is in journals, peer-reviewed journals. I'm a researcher. I work at the University of Melbourne. It is my job. But that's very different from the teacher in the classroom. So I want you to think that there are many levels within our system where different data is being used. And perhaps the question that we need to be thinking about is, what's the connection across the systems? As you can see, the number of people using social media, for example, has skyrocketed in the last 10 years. Is that credible evidence? It's everywhere. Look beyond education. Look at TripAdvisor. Look at car sales. Look at tourism. Health is another one. Think about Fitbits. People are using evidence to change their lives. Why aren't we doing that kind of, or have that kind of behaviour in education? It is very accessible. There are some issues, of course, in how you choose the data. And then we get to the issue of quality. We had the opportunity over the last couple of years to speak to several teachers about the use of evidence as a part of a large project, which I want to share with you. And what we were trying to understand is what teachers are actually using. And of course, classroom teachers would say, yeah, I use evidence. Where do you get it from? Pinterest? Google? How do you know it's any good? Oh, because it gets lots of likes. Is that quality? We asked a teacher if they had access to real evidence about the work that they were doing in the classroom, would they use it? And the answer, the scary answer, was no, I don't get to make decisions about what I teach. Somebody else does that. It's somebody else's job to look at the evidence. What I really want is to understand how to do what they want me to do. I want evidence about practice. There was no suggestion from all of the interviews that we conducted that quality was of issue. We also spoke to a number of researchers. Common theme amongst my colleagues was, I don't know what they want. I don't know whether the evidence that I am producing will be of any use to them. I don't know how to get it to them in a way that they can digest it. We do know that school leadership tend to look for evidence to make decisions about curriculum, programs, etc. But to some extent, they're not really considering the quality of that evidence. This is really what I want to focus on today. So the question is, what's real evidence in education? What's real evidence at every level of the system? I want you to think about, this is the Loch Ness Monster that you see up there. I was just recently in Scotland and I swear I saw Lockie, the monster. But of course, in the museum, they have so much evidence about the Loch Ness Monster. Some refuting and some saying definitely there is a monster there. And we had to make some decision based on the evidence what we were to believe. And interestingly, in the museum, they divided the evidence into the crowd, what the crowd thought, and what those who were researchers in the area thought. And they were completely different. The crowd believes that Nessie exists. The researchers don't. It's a big eel, just a big fish that's out there, or it's the sun. In the Australian context, our government is committed to evidence-based practice. Yep. Not sure what's happening. We'll just take that all back. You want to?
Which page now?
Oh, right. There we go. I can go back here this way.
Sorry, yeah.
I'll do it. That's right. I'm good. So the Australian government is committed to an Australian evidence-based institute in education. Our government in opposition last year committed $280 million to the development of an institute in evidence-based practice in education. Sadly, they didn't get in. The current government is still working on the idea and has committed funds. Last year, we were asked to do a review for government of evidence-based institutes around the world, evidence-based practice, synthesise the evidence and tell the government what is best practice. What are the key success criteria? I want to share some of this with you. So I'm thinking at a systems level at the moment. We had some interesting findings. So this was supposed to be a systematic review. We synthesised the evidence and used different mechanisms because there wasn't enough evidence about the impact of evidence-based institutes and the work that they were doing to demonstrate impact at every level of the education system. So we reviewed the grey literature, obviously the gold standard literature, policy documents, and then spoke to a number of key stakeholders and triangulated it. We identified over 6,000 records across the world about evidence base and its promotion of use through a system. And as you can see there, we interviewed a number of organisations across the world. We evaluated the quality of the research on evidence-based institutes using the ARCOTS method. These are the sources. So this was a very extensive review, which is what academics tend to do. this is the important factor here. Only 1.2% of that close to 7,000 documents reported practice or the impact of practice and actually focused on what they were doing and what the success criteria. Quality of the evidence was such that it was really hard to get some inter-rater reliability of what was happening. So the evidence on evidence-based practice and how it's been promoted is limited. We aren't evaluating our own promotion of evidence. There were a couple of other things that came out in terms of the way we are promoting evidence in our research environment. There was a study that was conducted in the early 2000s that demonstrated, on average, for gold standard research, we're talking about random control trials, it takes 17 years to come from conception to actually use in practice. Now, this was a study in health, so there are a few more hoops that you have to get through. 17 years. A recent study by Malouf and Taymans demonstrated that looking at 141 random control studies across the effects of schooling, that these are random control trials that were being meta-analysed for What Works Clearinghouse, Educational Endowment, etc. These studies and the policies that were stemming from these studies, on average, only had 2 actual studies in them that were acceptable. And what was even scarier is that the effect size from these 141 random control trials only had an effect size of 0.03. Now, we are basing our policies on this idea of real evidence. So the real evidence is not actually getting to the classroom. I don't expect you to see every bit of this diagram, but I just wanted you to show that our synthesis demonstrated that there were a number of key areas that were significant in terms of the promotion of evidence through a system. Implementation was an incredible challenge. Funding rounds, for example, limited skill in synthesising evidence, limited skill in accessing evidence, as you heard this morning from our departments of education that are awash with fantastic data that we could be working on. There was little idea about what effective research institutes in terms of supporting, promoting evidence-based practice were about. There was a broad number of topics, very little collaboration and co-design with people who were working in classrooms, teachers, educators. Knowledge translation had increased dramatically over the last 5 years, but the translation itself wasn't actually being promoted into use. So there are still some issues that we need to face. The key learnings for us were that there is a lack of agreed approach to evaluating the quality of evidence in the education space. There are many challenges in the methods being used to review evidence, as you saw from RCTs, from our What Works Clearinghouse, Cochrane, Campbell. Getting your research into those organisations has so many restrictions that few education pieces of research are getting there. So evidence-based, we concluded, is a very static thing, and it's hard to get people using it. The idea, particularly from the health focus, was if we thought about evidence-informed, if we thought about at each level of our system, people are being formed by evidence. What it actually does is it implies an idea of learning. it implies the idea of thinking about all levels of evidence around us. We came up with a model to promote the idea of evidence as an institution, as a government institution. And what we were able to do is to say, it's really about the principles and how you do it. It's about the principles of collaboration. It's about the principles of relevancy and appropriateness. We also were very clear that evidence is not going to get to a classroom unless you engage with classroom teachers and make that evidence relevant to them. But importantly, also consider the evidence around practice, the how to implement these key findings from the research. I'll come back to this model towards the end, but this is the model that we promoted to the government that basically suggests focus on key areas as we normally do. Think about how you generate, synthesise, manage, and then use data. The truth is, it's all about the use, and that there are a key number of principles for all the beneficiaries, the researchers, the practitioners, the policymakers, and those social commentators, the parents and students. So, what we want to do is to flip the coin a little bit, and I want to move to a piece of work that we've been doing with classroom teachers to actually generate and use evidence. So again, University of Melbourne, intent on building evidence and getting our teachers thinking about evidence. So let's look at evidence-based practice. We've thought about the system, we've thought about what we do. So I want to introduce to you a tool which you heard from one of the opening speakers called Visible Classroom. What Visible Classroom does is simply record classroom discourse in real time, and it provides teaching analytics based on that classroom discourse almost instantly within a 12-hour period back to the teacher. And we promote the idea of teachers and students engaging in an assessment of how that lesson went, how the experience of learning went, but literally providing information about practice in the classroom. I want to show you a little bit of it. It works this way. We have an audio captioner somewhere around the world who's simply listening to the conversation and is re-speaking it into Dragon. In some cases, we use speech-to-text programs. Speech-to-text programs in education at the moment are around, my understanding, about 86% accuracy. Visible Classroom, because of the work of our industry partner, AI Media, are up to 99.7% accuracy in terms of speech. So the teachers receive a transcript of all the talk in the classroom, plus analytics. They get a dashboard that looks like this about what they do. After a series of lessons, they'll get a report on their profile of teaching, the practice of teaching, not the content. So we did a study with the Educational Endowment Foundation. Yes, it was one of those random control trials. Currently we have 10,000, close to 10,000 lessons, and I want to share the kind of data. There's some interesting findings, so you might find that useful as well. So what we looked at is the frequency of activities within the lesson. So for example, are teachers using closed questions? Are they prompting? Are they introducing? Are they using deep thinking? Are they promoting feedback in the classroom? And what you can see from our 10,000 lessons from all of these teachers is there's really surface learning going on here. This is just simple frequencies. When you look at this frequency and you divide it into surface learning and teaching, deep learning, and then procedural, this is what you see. That most of the work we're currently doing in classroom is about surface, it's about content, and we aren't taking our teachers or our students into deep thinking. And there's a whole lot of stuff about the mechanisms of the classroom. Teachers, on average, are speaking at 171 words per minute. That's conversational speak. It's not, I don't believe I'm speaking that fast at the moment, but it's when you're talking to your friends. Dashboard indicates that primary school students, for example, understand when you speak at 120 words per minute. Talk time, on average, in those 10,000 lessons, teachers are talking to the student 89% of the time. And they're talking fast. Now here's the scary one. Think about the level of language that they are using with their students. What is the alignment between their level of language and the student's age? What you can see here, that the misalignment is 3/4. So our teachers are speaking fast, a lot, and at a language level above their students. In an average of 54 minutes, teachers can ask 142 questions on average. Some of that's rhetoric. Don't expect an answer. 4 to 5 of those questions are deepening understanding. John Biggs would be horrified. Students asking 11 questions. Okay, we're going to stop for a minute. I want you to look at this horrible graph. I've chosen 10 teachers from the bottom 50% of our ranked teachers in the frequency of each of these factors. It's just 10 classrooms, 10 teachers. And we've looked at the number of words per minute, teacher talk, level of language aligned, whether they're repeating student answers, comments, deepening understanding, the number of questions, whether those questions were open or closed, and student questions. So have a little look, just for 10, 15 seconds. What I want you to think about is what's happening in that classroom based on the averages that you're seeing in front of you. What I can tell you is absolutely nothing is happening in those classrooms. There is no learning going on whatsoever because of core, basic, instructional teaching practices. And don't get me started on how we work at a higher education level. Academics speak at 100% of the time and probably 190 words per minute and use so much jargon nobody can understand what they're saying. This is classrooms at years 3 and 4 in primary school. So it doesn't matter what program, evidence-based or not, you may be doing in these classrooms, it's not going to work. This was the message. It's very technical that we gave as a recommendation to all the teachers. The good news is that by providing feedback over time, change occurs, as you can see from these graphs. This is just a snippet. Look at the effect sizes. By providing feedback, by providing evidence back to the teachers about their practice, not everything changes. So the point is here, there is a wealth of evidence that we can actually use in the classroom that will make a difference. I think the findings and the study itself are interesting, but think about it from the point of view of evidence and the impact that evidence-based practice or evidence-informed practice can have. You will have all seen the many pieces of research that are out there. John Hattie's famous work in visible learning, for example, millions of meta-analysis that demonstrate evidence about teaching and what works in teaching. Now, part of the problem with visible learning, it was in a book, it was in a journal, we do some PD, not all getting out there, visible learning not getting into the water. What John Hattie and team have done is promoted visible learning by placing all of the evidence that they've gathered and put it freely available on a website, an interactive website called MetaX. MetaX, and you can all log into it, you can all use it. Every study that John has used within the meta-analysis is there, freely available for you to look at, interrogate, search. So what's starting to happen in the world is we are finding better ways of engaging with evidence. We also need to understand whether this kind of evidence will be utilised by teachers. I want to go one step further, and I want to do this really quickly, and think about the idea of a system level. So again, this is in an Australian context. This is the state of Victoria. Our government, education department within the state of Victoria asked us to work in an evaluation sense with a large statewide school improvement program. And what they wanted was for us to help them build a data portal that enabled quality data and the frequency of data to be collected not only for the evaluation, but to provide feedback and tailored feedback to the users so that change could occur instantly and teachers and schools could adapt regularly as opposed to waiting till the end of the evaluation or the end of the research project, which we traditionally do. So the idea was to improve the flow of data from classrooms to school leaders to the department, to watch progress, and if progress wasn't actually happening, then to target, step in and do something about it. To actually get educators at every level of the system working together to increase the use of evidence and adapt practice. So the portal, as you can see, also had some very practical views. The idea was to reduce the burden of time. Our schools are constantly under the threat of so much work in terms of collecting data and administration. If we ask our teachers to do one more thing, they just frown and roll their eyes. So the idea was to engage our teachers in building a portal that would make their lives a little easier. So we introduced the notion of co-design with our schools and said, what are you collecting? What do you want to know? How can we help? What's the best format to getting you using the data? As a consequence of this co-design process, looking for something that was relevant and addressing the problems, we were able to make massive change. This one, for example, the number of days that it used to take for a data request from a school classroom up towards the system reduced by half. Simply using a portal that our teachers went, yeah, we can do this. Yes, we get it. Make it look like this, we'll use it. The relationship in terms of using the knowledge that was gained and the feedback increased dramatically. What was required here was to build trust, to have transparency, to ensure that we're actually getting our leaders, our school teachers, and the Department of Education working together, thinking evaluatively, moving forward together, and ensuring that time was given to develop a system that was coherent for them, that made teachers' and leaders' lives a little easier. So, I want to bring it all together, and I want to think for a moment about where we are and consider all the evidence. What you've heard is, at a classroom level, in terms of teaching and learning, there's so much out there that tells us what works. But we are in a state of information overload. And we have to find a way to help our teachers navigate through this. My message is, rather than push the evidence through translation and fancy mechanisms on teachers and school leaders, is work with teachers to think evaluatively. But not only work with the teachers to think evaluatively, but work with researchers who don't know how to get their evidence into the classroom, to work with governments, to set up systems that allow the creativity and thinking about this new way of working. If we consider thinking evaluatively, what we want is our teachers to be looking at the evidence that they collect in the classroom and see it as worthwhile. We want our teachers to be able to consider, as we did with Visible Classroom, that data and make change on the spot, not just focus on the researcher's evidence. We want policymakers to focus on the researcher's evidence and what's actually happening in schools, so it becomes authentic, to use the assessment data that's out there, but translate it across the system. So if you consider evaluative thinking, it is really critical thinking with a purpose. It's valuing evidence, all forms of evidence. And it's being able to work together to ensure that what we're doing, we're thinking about the implementation of it. We're thinking about potential biases and quality. We're actually focusing on our impact and feeding that information back to the system so the system knows how we're working. Most importantly, understanding that at every level of our education system, people value and view evidence very differently. Pinterest may be fine. And when the teachers said to me, I look at Pinterest and I look at how many likes, how many times people have gone back to that. It can't be wrong if everybody's going back to it, can it? And I thought, well, it could be. But reality is, if a lot of teachers are actually using particular lesson plans or initiatives, it's probably having some effect. So thinking evaluatively, from my perspective, shifts the narrative to the way we think. And I go back to the John Biggs notion. It's about thinking. And if we can get our teachers at every level, tertiary, secondary and primary, to really engage in understanding their impact, gathering their evidence, but ensuring that that evidence goes up and the evidence from outside comes in. From my perspective, it's evaluative thinking that's going to create this link to use and ensure that evidence-informed practice is having an impact. So, what do we know about what works in teaching and learning? We know so much. It isn't getting where it needs to get. So I want to leave you with one thought. Thank you.